Hi everybody, today we're going to do a lesson on tides. So first you need to know what a tide is. It's the daily rise and fall of the ocean. So the two that should make the most sense to you, high tide would be the highest elevation that the ocean water gets. Low tide would be the lowest elevation. All right, and then the range, just like it is in math, is the difference between the high and the low tide. So all you have to do when you're calculating tidal range is subtract high tide from and low tide, and then you should have your range. Now, depending on, the range depends on several things. It kind of depends on your location. It depends on the shape of your coastline and how deep your coastline is. So as an example, off our coast, if you look at a tidal chart, the difference between our high tide and low tide is 1 to 2 meters, which is roughly 3 to 6 feet, okay, which isn't very much. But on the Canadian coast, it can be as much as 20 meters because of the shape of their coastline, and that can be 60 feet. So that's a big difference between high and low tide, and it depends on where you are, what the shape of the coast is, the depth of the water, and all that to determine the tidal range, okay? All right, so there are actually 3 tidal patterns that I want to talk about. The first one is going to be the easiest one because it's most relatable because it's what happens here. So semi-diurnal basically means 2 times a day, but it means 2 high tides and 2 low tides each day. So there are actually 4 tides and it alternate: high tide, low tide, high tide, low tide. Okay, and those are very predictable, like you can see in this chart here. This is for Topsail Inlet. You can find them for any coast, and it can predict the tide for months at a time. Okay, and even exactly what time they will be. So diurnal tide, that literally means twice a day. So that's when you're going to have 1 high and 1 low tide a day. So every 12 hours, the tide changes, whereas ours is every 6 hours. So diurnal tides can be found in the Gulf Coast, like Texas, Louisiana, the panhandle of Florida, things like that. Okay, now the mixed tide is what we find on the West Coast. It is very similar to our tide because there are 2 high and 2 low a day, but the second set is much weaker than the first set. So as an example of that, if you have a high tide at 8 feet and a low tide at 2 feet, the second set might be 6 foot and 4 foot. Okay, and they're very distinguishable on a graph because you'll have a really high one and a really low one, and then the other ones will kind of be mediocre. Okay, so East Coast, Gulf Coast, West Coast is the difference. And when we do our project, you're going to pick one state from each of these regions, and you'll kind of see what the tides do. Okay? All right, so now, very important, what causes the tides? There were a lot of theories for a really long time, but the biggest contributor to tides is the moon. Okay, so the moon is actually pulling on the Earth, even though it is much smaller than us, similar to how we pull on it. Okay, so the moon pulling on the Earth causes the tides to bulge. All right, so if the moon is facing this way, this is where you're going to get your high tides at the time. This is where you're going to have lower tides. So then as the Earth spins on its axis, this causes the tides to change because what's facing the moon. All right? So the sun also has an effect on the tides, but to a much lesser degree. The only time the sun really comes into play is when the sun and the Earth and the moon are aligned, or when the sun and the moon and the Earth are at 90 degrees to one another. Okay, so there are 2 times a month where we actually have a spring tide. This is when the sun, Earth, and moon are all aligned, and you're going to get really high tides and super low tides. Okay, so this happens when at new and full moons. So here's an example of that. Obviously, you guys know the moon can't be in 2 places at once, but this is showing when the moon is in between the sun and the Earth. That would give us a high tide. okay, exceptionally high tide. So this would be what we call a new moon, because you can't technically see it. It's not super bright because the sun's blocking it on the other side, all right? Now, on 2 weeks after that, when the moon is on the other side of the earth, okay, and it's actually, oh, I have that backwards. Okay, this one would be blocking it. That's right. So this time would be a new moon. This would be a full moon. Okay, so anyway, both of those times give you exceptionally high tides. Now, this one here, when the sun and the earth and the moon are at 90-degree angles, this is what we call neap tides. And this is first and third quarter, which don't let that confuse you. That's when you would see a half moon in the sky. Okay, so if you think about it like you're playing tug of war, it's like the sun is pulling it in this direction and the moon is pulling it 90 degrees in this direction. Okay, so your high tides are not going to be as high and your low tides are not going to be as low. That's what we call weaker tides. All right, so these are neap. So these happen twice a month. These happen twice a month, depending on the location of the moon. So what it does is it actually makes the higher tides higher, the lower tides lower, and then this one makes the higher tides lower and the low tides higher, if that makes any sense. Okay, I'll try to post another video. Maybe they can demonstrate that better than I can. Okay, now there are the highest tides, of course, would be when the sun and the earth and the moon are also closer to the earth. So you do remember that the sun and the moon are elliptical around each other, right? Like it's not a perfect circle, it's more of an ellipse, like an oval. So perigee is when the moon is closest to the earth, and an apogee is when the moon is farthest away from the earth. Okay, so obviously we would have the very highest tides if a perigee happened to happen during a spring tide also. Okay, and they happen once every few hundred years. It's not very common. Okay, and then something similar applies to the sun. Perihelion is when we're closest to the sun. Aphelion is when we're furthest from the sun. And it kind of goes against what I would think. We are actually closest to the sun in January, and we're furthest from the sun in July. Now, as hot as it gets in North Carolina in July, you would think it would be the other way around. But remember, the seasons are based on what's facing the sun, right? So just because the earth is closest to the sun in January doesn't mean North Carolina is facing the sun directly. Okay, we're still furthest away from the rays. The rays are coming at a different angle. Remember, that's based on the axis. Okay, so imagine if we had a perigee and a perihelion all on spring tides. You would have the largest high tide that you've ever had, probably, or the lowest low tide that you've ever had. And like I said, that doesn't happen very frequently. Okay, so here are pictures of that. And guys, don't make it look this dramatic. This picture makes it look way too dramatic. We are never that close to it, okay? It's just kind of giving you an idea that this is an ellipse. Aphelion means furthest away. Perihelion means closest. And the same thing with the moon and the earth. So closest, perigee. So remember, peri means close, okay? And then ap means away. So here's apogee, here's perigee. Aphelion, perihelion. Okay, all right, so lastly, I want to talk about two different kinds of animals that deal with the tides, and that's how they know how to run their life cycle. This little guy is a little fish up here. It's called a grunion. They're not common in North Carolina. They're more common on the west coast. Okay, so the females squirm into the sand and lay their eggs. And look at this, y'all. They figured out it's a specific 4-hour time period. Okay, on the second, third, or fourth day after a new or full moon. They squirm up there where actually the tide should be pretty high, right, if we've just had a full moon. They lay their eggs. Then the males come and fertilize the eggs, and then everything is washed back into the ocean. So spawning is what we call that. That actually occurs, is timed perfectly, so it occurs the second, third, or fourth days that follow a new or full moon. And then, over the next time period, they'll do this again. Okay, so these are called grunions. And in California and other places, there's actually an event called a grunion run where people actually can grab the grunions off of the beach. See, here they are here. So you don't even need a net, you don't need a fishing pole, you can just go grab them because they're too busy trying to mate. All right, the second animal I want to mention about that is a horseshoe crab. The males and females come together up onto the bays and marshes and inlets where it's shallow, and they spawn during a new or full moon when the high tide is the highest, and then they produce several eggs that are pale green, and there's like hundreds and hundreds of them. They incubate in the sand for the 2 weeks. Remember, that's when the tide is the highest, so technically the water shouldn't reach the eggs until the next new or full moon comes along 2 weeks later. Okay, and that gives them enough time to hatch, and then the tide carries the new little horseshoe crabs with them. Okay? All right, so that's it for tides today. We're going to do a couple activities with them over the next few days, so if you could complete your assignment for the day, and I will also post this flip chart up there for you to reference back to it as needed. Okay, hope you guys have a great day.